Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about Pillars of Eternity and Avowed, as created by Obsidian Entertainment. I'm your host, Eric, aka Gingerino. Thank you all for listening. Let's get into today's lore. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host Eric, aka Gingerino. Thanks everyone for joining me on another episode as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics for Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 as we gear up for the release of Avowed. For those wondering why Pillars of Eternity and Avowed are connected, it's because they share the same fantasy setting known as Eora. So if you're new to the show, welcome to the show, happy to have you here. We mostly just dive into the lore for this world that we're excited to play in and have stories in. Or if you're just a huge Pillars of Eternity nerd and this is something that you like to get into because you love the world, or you're even just trying to develop a tabletop role-playing game in this world, whatever the reason is, welcome to the show. Happy to have you here. Before we get started on the lore for today, I'm just going to re-emphasize some news that we had that I brought up last week, which is that the game of Avowed now officially has a release date. However, that release date has been delayed from whatever the original release date was going to be, which we don't know what that was. It was apparently supposed to be November 18th at one point, if you believe the post that was on the Obsidian website that got removed later on, but it has been officially announced to be releasing in February on the 18th of 2025, pretty much exactly 3 months later. Now, it is speculated that this is a delay due to the fact that there are so many games releasing in the holiday season of 2024. So it's not so much that Avowed isn't ready or that it's not polished or that it couldn't be released, but it's that they don't want the game to clash with other releases going on at that time. And not just in gaming in general, but also on the Game Pass service itself, which Avowed will be releasing on day one. We have the new Call of Duty game, the Black Ops game coming out in late October, as well the Indiana Jones game is coming out around that time, as well as a slew of other titles coming out of the Game Pass service, not to mention other titles like Dragon Age Veilguard is very likely coming out around that time, so it's just already a very full set of months in terms of gaming. And I think it's rather wise, personally, that they delay the game to a point where there's not going to be a lot of interference, where people can actually just focus on this one game or, this one and a very few others. So me personally, I'm not too upset about it. I'm actually kind of relieved, just for my own personal reasons. My schedule is very hectic around that time of year, and so trying to balance doing this podcast while honestly playing the game and also checking out other ones that I'm excited about is not really something that is going to be nearly as enjoyable as one would hope. And, that being said, as far as problems go, it's a pretty good problem. But anyway, so I'm okay with it personally, but I totally recognize that there are a lot of people who, they don't have personally hectic schedules around that time of year, and that was Avowed was the game that they were looking forward to playing, and so this is a major disappointment for them. And I understand where that is, and I feel your pain. Thankfully, it's only a 3-month delay, so you'll get your hands on it rather quickly. We're basically half a year away from playing Avowed. Now, that all said, what are we getting into on today's episode? Well, I'm back from vacation, so it's just nice to get back into the swing of things. However, being on vacation, I don't have anything I have gotten up to in that sense. So I haven't done any pre-recordings, and I don't have anything left in the bank in terms of just something I can upload. So I'm going to have some catching up to do in terms of doing research and things like that. Thankfully, I started a series not too long ago where I'm looking through the books of the History of Eora Anthology. For context on that, if you want to know what that's all about, go ahead and check out my first episode titled History of Eora. I think it's like 3 episodes prior to this one, as well as the Hand Occult episode, which is the most previous episode that isn't a bonus one. And that really explains the context for what the History of Eora Anthology book series is within the game of Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. But to give a quick synopsis right here, essentially there are these 16 books that you can find in the second Pillars game, and they all have statements about esoteric lore within the world of Eora. Some of it's known and familiar to players, and some of it deals with entirely skeptical things. There is the chance within the fiction of this world that some of these books could be editorialized and falsified, so any of the lore from these books that I'm going to be talking about could be false if the writers at Obsidian decide that they want them to be false. Me personally, I'm more of the mindset that they are likely true or that they allude to some level of truth. simply because they hired people to take the time to write this lore out, and I feel like they would want to honor that by at least giving some grains of truth within it. So I think it'll be worth talking about. I'm going to do a few episodes on this anthology series. My most previous one about this was about Avowed. Today's episode is going to be focusing on Dyrwood-related titles. Now, unfortunately, there are only 2 books in the series that are going to be worth really looking at. A third that we can kind of take a stop in, but I already talked about one of them in the previous episode. So not a ton of those books today, but that's okay. We're going to be going through them all eventually. I do want to talk about the Ingwithan Empire, as well a bit about the gods, and as well, finally, I'm going to want to talk about what I consider the apocalyptic books of the 16. So join me today in taking a look at the Esoteric History of Eora Anthology series, volumes 3 and 4 today.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
So, as I said, we're going to be diving into these books that you can get in-game. As I said, they are part of the Deadfire game, the second Pillars of Eternity game, but more specifically, they are in the Forgotten Sanctum DLC, and you can find these books when you are exploring the main area that is associated with that DLC. And the lore that is hidden within these books is supposed to be esoteric. It's supposed to contain information that not everybody in the world of Eora is got within like common knowledge or something like that. And that is because the people who are in charge of holding on to these books is the Hand Occult, which is a faction associated with the god Wall, and they're essentially a set of librarians that want to control the flow of esoteric knowledge within the world of Eora. And so these 2 volumes I'm looking at today, volume 3 and 4, they talk about some stuff that we learn about from the first Pillars of Eternity game in the setting of the Dyrwood, which is the setting for that game. So let's dive into it and see what they talk about and see if it sheds any light on some stuff that we know from Pillars of Eternity 1. The first book we're going to look at, The History of Eora, Volume 3, is titled The First Hollowborn. Now, right off the bat, I suppose we'll need to give a description of what a Hollowborn is in case you haven't played Pillars of Eternity, or you skipped every single piece of dialogue when playing Pillars of Eternity if you did. A Hollowborn is a person who is basically born without a soul. That's pretty much the best way of putting it. That was what a Hollowborn person is. Because in this world, the soul is a very real and tangible thing that you can actually, in a sense, engage and interact with on some level. In fact, there's even an entire scientific field called animancy dedicated to exploring the soul and performing experiments and measuring it and quantifying it, all that sort. And so a person who is born without a soul, as a body that is functioning and existing and breathing, but does not have a soul in it, is a Hollowborn person. Now, that in and of itself is interesting enough, but this is also very likely referring to the Hollowborn crisis that happened within the first Pillars of Eternity game. In the first Pillars of Eternity game, there is something going on that is, it's exactly what it sounds like, a Hollowborn crisis. There is a major crisis going on during the time of that game that you, the watcher, are going to be engaging with, especially in the narrative and talking with other NPCs. And the crisis is that a whole bunch of babies are being born in this generation, and a lot of them, if not all of them, are seemingly being born Hollowborn. So there are not a lot of children running around. There's not a lot of new infants crying about. There's just not a lot of new families being made because a Hollowborn person is born and they just merely sit there and breathe. They don't think. I don't think they even eat. I'm not really sure if they do. They just merely exist. And so this is a major crisis, not just for the continuation of your people, but it's also really, really distressing for the families that have these Hollowborn children. This book is referring to what is called the First Hollowborn. What we have is a little excerpt from what the entire book would be. It's just a couple paragraphs, and it reads, "His parents named him Gramwin, and he slept soundly through the night. Every night, from the day of his birth and for every day after. He didn't scream or cry, but only stared, blank-eyed, as the world turned about him. Gramwin had no siblings, nor would he ever. When one's neighbor's child was born similarly silent, then another and another, Gramwin's parents were named Curse-bringers. They were burned in the town square, and Gramwin was left alone on a hillside just as the season's first snow began to fall. Of course, that didn't stop the hollowing. For 15 years, nothing would." So this is a rather sad book to read on this here podcast, talking about the first Hollowborn child that existed within the Hollowborn crisis. Gramwin is a very, I would say, expected name within that culture, whether it's, I guess, Glamfathan or Dyrwood. It definitely sounds like something that matches that region. But yeah, it tells the sad tale of the first child who was born into the Hollowborn crisis, and that the parents were unfortunately labeled as curse bringers and killed as a result. And it seems like this infant was just left on a hillside somewhere. I suppose the only solace we can have in an imagery like that is that there was no real person inside of the infant. Like, there wasn't anyone in there to like note their suffering or something. It was just simply a biological machine at that point in time, just sitting there taking in data and information. Which, I don't know, maybe people like me, I need to rationalize it like that, because I am such a softie. I will cry at anything. Weird though, I don't like cry at movies and stuff. That's not like me saying it's a problem, I just don't. But I will cry at a moment's notice when I think of something sad, and this is definitely something sad to think about for sure. But yeah, this is the onset of the Hollowborn crisis within the Dyrwood. And as it says here, it lasted for 15 years. And if you want to know more about the Hollowborn crisis, then you can go ahead and play the first Pillars of Eternity game, and you'll learn a lot more there. I think I'm also going to try to do an episode about it. I don't think I've ever done one just on the Hollowborn crisis, because it usually is mentioned a lot throughout numerous episodes, since it's related to a lot of other lore as well. The next book in this series, Volume 4, is titled The Founding of Readceras. Now, Readceras, or as it's, I guess, known in its official title, is the Penitential Regency of Readceras, previously referred to as the Divine Kingdom of Readceras, is just often shortened to Readceras. It is defined on the Pillars of Eternity fandom website as an ecclesiastic nation northeast of the Dyrwood, which is the setting for the first Pillars game, that was formerly a colony of the Aedir Empire, and later an independent theocratic dictatorship. So Readceras is another colony of the Aedir Empire. You might remember, if you've been listening to some of my episodes, that the Aedir Empire, which first off is the empire that your player character in Avowed is going to come from, the Aedir Empire also settled on this continent known as the Eastern Reach, and they set up some colonies. One of those colonies being the Dyrwood, which again, setting for the first Pillars game. Another colony that they set up is the Readceran colony. Now, the Readceras colony, I don't think, if I remember correctly, I don't think it produced nearly as much profit as the Aedir Empire was hoping for, and so they easily let go of that colony, letting it kind of be its own thing. And either way, though, the Readceran colony kind of became what it was referred to here on this Wikipedia-type website as an independent theocratic dictatorship. And they essentially became a religious state, if you will. And they specifically followed the god Aethys. And Readceras is a very important nation within the history of the Eastern Reach, especially in the recent years before Pillars of Eternity 1, because they actually led a religious crusade against the Dyrwood, and that was an important part of the foundation for the story that the Pillars of Eternity narrative is founded upon. And so this book, The Founding of Readceras, is obviously going to be about the founding of that nation, what it was for. And so this is, again, an excerpt from what would theoretically be a larger book, but we get this one paragraph here. But the Delumgun and Adragun could not come to accords. They launched a quiet civil war, and the colonist farms became the front. The Adragun blighted the Adirans' vorless crops with a might native to the deep forest. The colonists, believing themselves under attack by the notoriously territorial Delumgun, retaliated by clear-cutting the forests surrounding their villages. Not to be outdone, the Delumgun drained the subterranean aquifers in the Valian settlements. So we have a couple things going on here. So this is talking about the founding of Readceras, and within this excerpt, it's only referred to as the Adirans' vorless crop. It doesn't say anything else. It does call them colonists. So this place isn't even called Readceras yet at the time that this book is being written in. But it seems that this event between these two groups of the Delumgun and the Adragun have something to do with the founding of Readceras. To back up a little bit, Delumgun and Adragun are two different types of creature that you can find within the world. The Delumgun are referred to as forest spirits in the official lore for the world, and I've often referred to them as almost like humanoid incarnations of the forest that they live in. It's almost like the forest has like willed itself a creature to like represent itself. That's why I say it's like the forest incarnate. I don't think that's maybe the best definition. That's just my kind of working definition. I think Carrie Patel referred to them as forest nymphs or things like that. They do in some way represent the forest or the immediate environment that they are found within. And I believe Delumgun actually stands for forest spirit or something along those lines, or something to do with a leaf, I think. Either way, this Delumgon and this other group of creature known as Adragon, which is the same kind of idea, but instead of it being a forest, it's more related to Pillars of Adra. Adra being this gemstone that exists within this world that is very unique and prized because it is capable of housing souls. And like soul gems from Skyrim, if you need that comparison, although it's not quite the same thing, because these Pillars of Adra are the Pillars of Eternity that the game even references, so they're far more central than, soul gems from Skyrim. But anyways, these creatures that not come out of the Adra, but these creatures that spring up in the environment around Adra, that are created from the environment where Adra are. Like I said, it's almost like Adra incarnate, if you will. And these Delumgon, which is like the forest incarnate, these like nymph-like creatures, they're clearly some sort of discord that's coming between them. As it says here, that they couldn't come to an accords. So they had this quiet civil war amongst each other. Because normally these creatures, I believe, would live in harmony with each other, or they would at least tolerate each other. But there was clearly something going on here that they were in disagreement about. And so they had this quiet civil war, which I think just means that no one really knew about it, including these Aediran colonists that would then become Readceras. What they were trying to do here is they were trying to produce vorless crops. These Aediran settlers were trying to produce vorless crops, which is useful in the purple dye industry. And at this kind of Renaissance era time of technology, purple dye is the rarest and hardest of the dyes to make, which is why it's often associated with royalty. And that's in our own Earth history, by the way. And so it's very likely that's also true within this world as well, is that the purple dye is important not just for coloring royal robes and things like that, but there are other uses as well. Either way, the vorless crops is what those were for. But the Adragons blighted the vorless crops of these Aedirans with a might that is native to the deep forest. And they did this so that, and they were successful in it, that the Aedirans thought that they were being under attack by the Delumgon, so then the Aedirans attacked the Delumgon. So it sounds like the Adragon were pretty clever in getting the Aediran colonists to destroy the forest where the Delumgon were. Now, this book is called The Founding of Readceras, and it doesn't actually mention anything about this colony now forming called Readceras, but I think that this moment in history is kind of a turning point that let Readceras be what they were. Because if you'll remember me mentioning, Readceras was a Aediran colony, but the Aediran colony, the Aediran Empire in control of them, kind of eventually let go of ties. There's a little bit more going on there, but long story short is that it wasn't being as successful as they wanted, and so it was a lot easier for them to give it up, if that makes sense. And it seems to me like this attack that the Adragon did was one of those either inciting events that just did that, or perhaps it was the straw that broke the camel's back, or perhaps this one event referenced here was actually a series of events over a period of time that led to a Aediran Empire letting this colony go. And they became their own nation, the nation of Readceras, which led to a whole bunch of really important historical moments within that area of the world. So you have this entire history and a whole narrative and this whole video game that we play in the first Pillars of Eternity game, and it all goes back to this moment when a bunch of Adragon let loose some mites that destroyed a vorless crop in a colony somewhere, and like that was a clincher in the entire history of this world. And so there you go. It's just a really interesting note on how something so small can domino effect to something so big down the road. Now, obviously, this is all fictional, right? So like people are writing this stuff in, but still, it's really interesting to look at. The book does end talking about the Delumgon draining the subterranean aquifers in Valian settlements, but we don't know what that refers to. There is the temptation in my mind to think that it refers to the Valian republics far, far, far to the south. However, I don't see this tiny civil war, or I guess this quiet civil war between Delumgon and Adragon stretching quite that far, because that is a really long distance. That being said, perhaps what this book says here about Delumgon and Adragon, maybe that's not just isolated to the area of Readceras. Perhaps this is a quiet civil war that actually is being engaged upon across the entire continent of the Eastern Reach. I've never really considered that before, actually, until just now talking about it. But yeah, perhaps Delumgon and Adragon don't like each other? I don't recall them fighting in the Pillars of Eternity games. I thought I saw some of them fighting side by side against me, but I don't know, maybe that's like an enemy of my enemy situation. Am I missing something? I wonder. Interesting. Either way, there you go. So I suppose it could be the Valian Republics that this is referring to here, but it's not important to the title of this book, which is The Founding of Readceras. So there's nothing else to say there, and there's only stuff that we could speculate about. I don't remember hearing anything or reading anything about the water at the Valian settlements going away. So who knows what that refers to, but clearly nothing that we can discuss here or need to discuss here. And so this is going to be this is a short episode today. I know that, especially with me being gone last week, that perhaps there's expectation maybe be a bit longer. Apologize. But I wanted to talk about that stuff today before I move into more spoiler-related ones in the next coming weeks with this stuff. And so that's actually all we have to talk about on today's episode regarding the lore from the History of Eora Anthology series regarding the Dyrwood. And a lot of this stuff is already kind of known, but it does offer some interesting finer points, little granular pieces of lore about, where did Readceras come from, but like, how did it actually happen? And it also talks a little bit more about the origins of the Hollowborn, like specifically who the first Hollowborn person was. And that's an interesting story there, and it's crazy to see how these tiny little details spun out of control to become the major historical events that they actually were. So that's everything that we have for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it, even though it was a shorter one. I'm hoping to come back next week with something a little bit longer. I am looking forward to doing the rest of this series in bigger chunks and talking about bigger, more speculative topics in the coming weeks, but some of them are going to be a little bit spoilery. So I'm kind of, I don't know, I guess letting people catch up, I guess, is the thought process I'm having, but whatever. It is what it is. Anyways, let's ask, are any of these things going to be related to Avowed in any way, shape, or form?
Is an oath worth the weight of a crown?
The short answer is that probably not. There's probably nothing that's going to be related to this. Gromwyn's parents were killed by being burned in the town square, and Gromwyn, the infant, probably died on the hillside somewhere, never had their soul come back. I suppose there is the chance that maybe the infant was found by someone and they couldn't leave it there, and they kept it alive, and then, I don't know, maybe they found a way to put the soul back into it or something like that. But I doubt we're going to see or hear or know of Gromwyn at all within Avowed. As well, I don't know if there's going to be any relationship between Delumgun and Odragun and Readceras in the game of Avowed. I don't see why or how that would be related. That being said, if there is this quiet civil war going on between Delumgun and Odragun, and it's not just isolated to this one geographical area, if it is, in fact, actually something that is systemically going on between those two species of creature, there is, I suppose, the chance that it wouldn't just be landlocked to the Eastern Reach continent. Perhaps this actually stretches out across the world itself. And so could there be something like that in Avowed? Because we know there are Delumgon in Avowed. We see them in the more recent trailers and deep dives, and it doesn't seem to me like it'd be out of the question that we would also see Odragon in the world. And because these are two wilder creatures, they are able to be interacted with and spoken to. We see that again in the more recent videos for Avowed. So it'd be interesting to see if actually there is kind of another quiet civil war going on in the Living Lands, where Avowed is set between Delumgun and Odragon, and you have to choose a side or help them out, or maybe you have to release a mite into a nearby town. That would be pretty interesting to actually do like a complete parallel event in the Living Lands in Avowed that mirrors this history from Readceras and how they were destroyed, and then another town is founded or something happens. That would be interesting, and I wonder what the outcome of that would be within the Living Lands. We can't possibly know because we don't know everything about the map and what's going on there politically, but I don't know, interesting idea. So I suppose that might happen, but again, I feel pretty unlikely, but it'll be interesting just to interact with Delumgon and Odragon in Avowed. I'm really looking forward to that because that's not something you do a ton of in Pillars of Eternity. It does happen, but it doesn't happen all the time. So over my vacation last week, I played a game called Flintlock Siege of Dawn, which I'm sure a lot of people have heard about. It's on the Game Pass service, day one. It's developed by A44, which also created the game Ashen. Both of these games are considered Souls-like, although I would consider Ashen. I would consider Ashen more Souls-like than Flintlock. Flintlock Siege of Dawn is Souls-light, I think is a good description that they have used for it, but I still think that it's not necessarily the best tag for it. I know a lot of people that when they hear Souls-like, they actually decide, I'm not going to play that game, and I think that might be a disservice to Flintlock. Flintlock plays honestly more like God of War than anything else, but has borrowed a few key mechanics from the Dark Souls games that FromSoft has developed. So, for example, the whole bonfire thing, they have that mechanic in there, as well as losing your accrued currency when you die, and you have to go pick it up before you die again in order to use it, and that levels up your character and stuff like that. Those two primary mechanics exist in Flintlock, but the rest of the game, like the combat and the skill progression, and just even the way the narrative is explored, it plays way more like a God of War game in that particular sense. It was a pretty short experience, 12 and a half hours, and I managed to do the main quest along with, I would say, all of the side quests, but I don't know if there's any I missed. I didn't really try that hard to find out. So I pretty much got nearly all of the skills done. And I was really satisfied with the game. It crashed a few times, which was a bit disappointing, but they had some really interesting gamey mechanics, like a modifier for every time you kill an enemy, you are able to get increased rewards if you continue to hit enemies without getting hit yourself. But the moment you get hit, you lose your multiplier and you just get the rewards at whatever the base amount is. And so that's got a really interesting risk-reward system to it. It also really does focus on parrying and counterattacking, so I don't know how people feel about that. But I think it's really well done. I felt like the window for that and the telegraphing for it was fair but challenging at normal mode. One thing I didn't like is that if you're on easy mode, achievements are turned off, which I think is a little bit punishing for people who maybe aren't used to games like this. That seems a little unfair. As well, there are some people out there who just, they may have mobility issues or something like that, right? So it feels needlessly punitive in that sense, but whatever. I mean, achievements aren't the most important thing in gaming. I think the game itself is more important, but that's still, it's a detail that matters. But other than that, I really enjoyed it. The writing was pretty good, and I liked the banter between the two main characters. I didn't really feel a sense of being able to use my reputation, which is the currency that you have in game. It's like souls from Dark Souls. I didn't really feel like I was going to use it for a lot of stuff that I had options for, like aesthetically changing my character. I never spent any of that on that because I just spent it on skill upgrades or upgrading my equipment. And I was never really open to the idea of changing out my equipment. I played the entire game from front to back with basically the base equipment that you start with, which is good in the sense that if that's something that intimidates you, that you don't need to worry about it, you can just level up the things you already have. The downside, though, is that I wanted to check out some of these other things, but I felt like I didn't want to invest the currency to upgrade them to a proper level and then find out that I didn't like it. So there was no way to play around with that in a risk-free way that I think is kind of important. I think it's important to be able to give people the option to really check something out in a good way before letting them know that they can make that commitment, if that makes sense. But otherwise, if you're looking for a good action RPG with, decent writing, an interesting enough world, and something that's short and sweet, like I say, you can get through the game pretty quick, then by all means, check out Flintlock Siege of Dawn. It's on Game Pass, so if you already have Game Pass, no reason not to check it out. But now that I'm done that, and I'm glad I was able to start and finish a game in my vacation, I don't know what I'm going to play next. I'm thinking Dungeons of Hinterberg might be the next thing, just because, again, it's on Game Pass, but I also have a huge backlog on Steam, so I don't know, maybe I'll check that out. But yeah, that's me. If you have anything you want to share, like if you've played Flintlock and you had kind of thoughts about it, or you have any questions about the lore from today, or you just have something you want to say about the show or about the world that we're talking about, send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. If you're interested, also join me on Twitter @worldofeora. I mostly just post updates on when shows are out, but I'll post anything as well that Obsidian has or thoughts that I think are important. If you've been listening for a while and you're like, hey, I'd like to support this show, even just a one-time thing, or be a regular supporter, you can do so at ko-fi.com/worldofeora. Thanks everybody for joining me today as we talked about these two books from a larger series of books that you find in the second Pillars of Eternity game, Forgotten Sanctum DLC, that talks a little bit more about the granular lore for two major events within the history of the first Pillars game, and it's a little bit more esoteric, and it offers a little bit more insight as to how these events actually transpired and what actually caused them. I know I've enjoyed it, and I'm looking forward to getting into the rest of this series in future episodes. But that's everything for today, everybody. Thanks so much for joining me. I've been your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and I'll see you guys next time.